Great. So hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us in continued discussions on the application of behavioral science in the UN. And our topic today is behavioral science and gender. So my name is Mary McLennan, and I lead what's called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which is an initiative of the UN Innovation Network, bringing together more than 700 colleagues from across the system from more than 60 entities in 110 countries. There's quite a bit of breadth and depth to the group, not only geographical differences and different entities that we come from, but also regarding experiences with behavioral science. So we have colleagues who are new to the field and are kind of learning from an introductory standpoint. And there are also colleagues who are actual behavioral scientists themselves. So regarding our work so far, if you're curious to hear more about what we do, we hosted UN Behavioral Science Week in June. We have a variety of webinars featured there on our YouTube channel and our website, which hopefully Johanna can put in the chat. We also played a role in the launch of the UN Secretary General's guidance note on behavioral science, which was released in June, and also the UN Behavioral Science Report, which features experiences from 25 UN entities. To join the group, as we mentioned, you can click on the link, which should be in the chat shortly, or follow us on Twitter to hear more about our work. But for the sake of today's webinar, you'll hear from two presenters, one from UN Women and one from the World Bank. And we ask that you put your questions into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. We will take a few questions after each presentation, but we'll reserve sort of the end for more of a discussion on the topic. If you have any questions, let us know in the chat. Johanna and I will be there. My colleague Johanna, who runs the UN Innovation Network more broadly, will be there to help as well. Okay, so on to our speakers for today. So first we'll hear from Maria Noel Villeza from UN Women, and then from Tasmia Rahman from the World Bank. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Maria Noel. So over to you.
If I can be unmuted. Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much. It's a true honor for me to share UN Women's innovation experience about behavioral science in Latin America and the Caribbean, as I manage the regional office. I want to express my gratitude to Mary and all the team in the lab of behavioral science, because you are at the forefront, pushing all of us to be much more innovative, and also bringing in your set of webinars very good practices and experts, so we can learn more. I'm not an expert in behavioral science, but I see that it's so important to apply behavioral science and other behavioral insights to gender, particular in the 4 areas that we are working on as UN Women, which is governance and participation in public life, women economic empowerment, ending violence, and women, peace and security, and humanitarian. So if you can go to the next slide, please. My quick review today is about 3 things: UN Women's innovative experience with behavioral science, qualitative findings, and lessons learned. So let's go to the next slide, UN Women innovative experience about behavioral science. The team with the behavioral science, the global organization that is working on the benchmark, it's advising us how to use behavioral science to improve women's lives. And we requested a study on how to engage men in preventing violence against women. So here is the publication that, of course, is for everybody to see and to share. And what we have done is a review of behavioral science and violence against women literature, focus specifically on barriers and on successful intervention, like, for example, the SASA methodology in Africa that engages community leaders, and of course, how to engage with facilitators that will really ramp up a behavioral change. For us, the social norms are essential to be changed, and we have to continue researching on how to use behavioral science to really trickle a change in behavioral change. And the other thing that we have done with this study is a semi-structured interviews with 26 men and experts who work in violence against women. So we have had some qualitative funding. So go to the next, please. With this study that we have done with a behavioral science group, we have 4 qualitative fundings. The first one is there are more awareness and discussion around the concept of women's equality, violence against women, masculinity, and gender dynamic, more and more. But as we move the discussion, there's also a group that is discussing, on the other way around, saying, what is this masculinity? There's only one masculinity. There's only women and men. So we see like a pendulum in our region. The more you try to be inclusive, the more you try to talk about intersectionality, that women are not the same, that we have indigenous women, Afro-descendant, women with different identities and orientation, sexual identities and orientation, etc. The more there is a pendulum background saying, no, the women should stay home, should look after the children. And they grouped into something is called ideology of gender. They are saying that we want something different that is not in the nature of women and men. So we are dealing with these political pendulums while we are trying to study where we can find some niches to do this behavioral insight and behavioral changes. And for us is getting on the way of government, civil society, and private sector. So we work with all the society as a whole. The other element that is very much in our studies and our funding is the harmful gender stereotypes that are still very prevalent. So that's what we are tackling, the gender stereotype. And for example, we did a study with different banks in Chile, men and women actresses, to go and get a loan. And 25% less of loans were given to women just for the fact that they were women. The men that were providing the risk assessment of the loans decided not to give it to women because of their prevailing stereotypes. But this represented more than $5 billion less credits given to the public if you do a projection. So it is real issue that is hampering the development, that is hampering the inclusion, and it continue to increase the discrimination. That's why we need behavioral science to look into all these things. And the other finding is when it comes to participation in women in violence against women programs, experts and men generally are those men who are involved in programs when they are in crisis. They don't get involved before, they get involved when some crisis got them or are around them. So it means that it's something that they are not thinking how to support women or how to enable an environment that is free from violence. So this is why we need to engage much more men, much more experts in order to establish this environment that will help us to enable this qualitative change. And the fourth is that most programs that mention the focus on preventing perpetrators rather than promoting allyships. So, the prevention is critical, but also to promote how men can be allies of women to enable environments that are peaceful and eliminate violence against women, which is our main concern. So this is more or less the full qualitative funding. Then if you go to the next, we have some lessons learned. And through our collaboration with BIT, we have been learning more about how people behave and how context impact our judgments and our decision making. So for us, this is critical, and this is a big learning from us, the context and the impact in the judgment of decision making. So based on key lessons, we design and develop model campaigns aimed at engaging bystanders in preventing violence against women. And this model campaign was evaluated through randomized controlled trials using the Predict platform, and then the remote test learning was integrated into the campaign material. So for us, it's essential to continue testing this to change behavior. We need to continue experimentation, piloting, prototyping, as well as investing in inclusive innovation. And of course, for us, it's critical data. Data is very, very important, because otherwise we cannot inform properly the public policies or the measures that government should take. So for us, data and transparency of data is essential. We have in Latin America and worldwide a program that is called He for She. It's a campaign that provided the opportunity to implement activities that promote the engagement of men, mostly programs related to violence against women and care and the economy of care. So we are trying also to enhance our work with men and masculinity, and continue promoting these things through different campaigns and as I said, different pilots. The next. So if you go to the key examples that we are working in our region, as I said, we have new model campaign, and we are testing them in Bolivia and Guatemala. We're testing them with men, messages that are informed with behavioral science, that encourage men to intervene before cyber violence happen, before violence happen. 3 of the 4 messages increase the intention to intervene to stop perpetrators. So the golden rule messages, which told men what to do against cyber violence, was the one that best performed consistently in various subgroups, both in Bolivia and Guatemala. And in Mexico, we launched a very interesting campaign called Dejemos de Hacerlo, Let's Stop Doing It, that it was embedded in a global program that we have that is called Safe Cities and Safe Public Spaces. And what we discovered is that this was a contribution to social change through transforming behaviorals and attitude in men between 18 and 35 years old. The aim was to denormalize sexual violence against women in public spaces and promote critical thinking and empathy among so-called switchers, those persons that tend to behave as sexual harassment, but could recognize and modify their behavior. So for us, the result was that the issue of sexual harassment was made visible in public spaces, in public transport, creating awareness and how these actions are really annoying for women, of course. And more than 90% of men that were surveyed agreed that the message about sexual harassment, that they didn't imagine that was sexual harassment. It was a sort of an education element. And also the campaign helped to rethink the profile and stereotype of sexual harassers and encourage the term sexual harassment to be applied without prejudice and without preconceived ideas. So those are the things that we're testing right now. And in the last slide, you will see that the investment in capacity strengthening through behavioral science has the potential to facilitate the achievement of the SDG. And that's why we have to test them, because it can be a trigger of accelerating those behavioral changes that we need to leverage social innovation for gender equality based on behavioral insight and human-centered design inform innovative advocacy that includes men above everything, because they are the one who needs to change their thinking on gender equality. Just thank you very much. Sorry that I rushed, but I wanted to say so much, and I'm here for questions. Thank you. We can hear you, Mary.
Apologies, I muted myself. Thank you for that, Marie-Noelle. Very, very interesting, and great to conclude with the quote from the Secretary General at the end. So I haven't seen any questions come through just yet, but I have one for you that I think many colleagues on the line might be interested in as well. So you talk about your experience with qualitative methods as well as data. What are some of the challenges that you had kind of coming into behavioral science and this initial kind of thinking that you might, some lessons learned in practice you think other entities might be keen to hear about?
Well, I think we have to invest in knowledge, because it's very new for all of us. There isn't any expertise in-house, so at least in my regional office. So that's why we try to engage with the BIT and with your group, because we need to learn, and we need to understand that without understanding the changes that are needed for changing their behavioral, it's difficult to mobilize a campaign or a program, a pilot program. And I think this has helped us, because we do a lot of campaigns. UN Women has a distinctive, I would say, well known for our campaigns. So this is what we're trying to embed now in all our campaigns in ending violence. For example, a campaign with the press that we're doing to change the big elements of how the press address sexual harassment and feminicides. So this opened us a door to do differently what we used to do. So if I may say, that's the big lesson learned.
Great, thanks for that. These are all things that we want to hear, opening new perspective, new ways of thinking. This is what we like to hear. So I just have a question from Darren Brown in the chat here. I don't know, would you like to ask it yourself? Yeah, you feel free to ask it. I can also read it out. It might
Mary,
be challenging.
I've just unmuted Darren.
Okay.
Hi, Darren. Okay, but I'm not sure you want.
I could ask it myself.
Come on in.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a concise presentation and some key takeaways for me. I want to ask the question, if I heard correctly, did you say it was during a slide telling men what to do rather than what not to do has better outcomes? Yeah, could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yes, of course. And that was a campaign that we started in Mexico that was so very successful. It is, instead of saying you're the perpetrators, you are the one who have the bad behavior, we said, okay, what is it that you can do to change the environment where a woman feels unsafe, a woman feels discriminated, a woman feels attacked? And they said, but we're not doing anything. But if we put certain behaviors that those men normally do, for example, in the public transportation, normally they look at a woman's breast or at a woman, back. And instead of saying to them, this is bad, you shouldn't be doing it, we say, what can you do to avoid that to happen? And that created an analysis that we did that they don't even were aware that what they were doing was sexual harassment. So we mix the let's stop doing it with education. And then they realized, oh my God, this is hurting women. I didn't even know. So that triggered this conversation, and it was amazing how it changed also the women's safety when they were about to take the metro. Of course, it's something that you have to do on a regular basis, but it generated a different awareness, not an awareness of I am the perpetrator, but an awareness I am somebody that can change behaviors. I don't know if I answered, but I can
Very,
send you
very well.
the link. Thank you.
Yeah, very helpful. Very interesting questions, and that's interesting academic questions too. Okay, so we'll take one more question and then we're going to go to Tasmia. So we have one from, how about Ivan? Would you like to ask your question?
May I please go ahead and read it out?
Read it out. Okay, so one of the challenges of behavioral science is the actual application of behavioral science tools. Which of them can you share with us to fight discrimination against women in working environments? So into the workplace, what have you done work there? Do you have thinking there that might be helpful or relevant?
Well, thank you for that question. We are promoting the Convention 199 and 90 together with ILO, of the Convention of Sexual Harassment in the Workspace. So we are trying now something similar, because we are discussing with the regional director of ILO a campaign to do that. First of all, only Latin American countries has ratified the convention. There are 3 Latin American countries that have ratified the convention. There are 6 that are about to ratify. We believe very strongly about the legal framework. You know, this region is very legalistic. So we are about to start developing a campaign. So I hope to put elements there. But so far we have worked more in violence in the public space and in public transportation. So hopefully next year I can answer your question properly. But we are planning to do something similar of what we have done with the public space and public transportation. You know, changing the
the setting a little bit. Yeah, that's
yes.
helpful. Okay, so maybe we'll take one more actually. Joanne, you have 2 questions here in the chat. If you'd like to, in the Q&A box, if you'd like to ask one or maybe consolidate them into one, I can give you the floor.
Joanne from Ireland, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, I wasn't sure how to mute. So no, I just wanted to jump in. Thanks so much for this excellent on different entry points in terms of how we are dealing with issues, you know, and
Joanne, I'm very sorry, but we can't hear you well. So apologies. I'm going to ask Mary to please take the question on your behalf.
Sure.
Sorry.
Okay, I'll take the first one that's listed here. So there are many areas we need to work on to make a difference. Can lessons and experiences be applied to overall education initiatives for youth? Also, potentially, how do you deal with women's own internalized discrimination towards themselves and other women? Are those issues you've been thinking about or considering?
Well, yes, what we saw is that women also, where they had so normalized the harassment that they didn't realize that that was a harassment. That was our first surprise when we selected women to work with us in this campaign. And she said, but that's not harassment. Yes, it is harassment. You know, you need to be aware of this. So there was an element of education in both ends. And at the end of the day, we empower the rights of women, and we empower also the right of men to be part of a solution. And I think that's a critical thing, that men and women both should be empowered to find out the solution. So I hope we can do that with harassment in the workspace, next year. And we continue doing in the safe spaces, the public spaces and the transportation. This is critical because otherwise women is suffering, girls and women are suffering a continuum of violence all the time. And because it's continued, it is normalized. So it is so normalized that, you know, they feel less. And I give you my own example. I'm from Uruguay, Montevideo. So every time I walked in Montevideo, I had this man telling me things. And when I was 21, I went to live in Paris. And nobody looked at me and nobody said anything to me. So I was like, oh my God, am I ugly now that I moved to France? Why are these men not telling me anything? So I have normalized the harassment so much that it was ingrained in my self-esteem. And this is what we need to disentangle, you know. Harassment is bad in any way or form. So don't think that is normal, you know. So I think that there's a lot of education for us. Instead of all the time focus on the perpetrators, we have to focus also on empowering women's rights, in my view.
Very interesting. We could talk about this topic for a very long time. This is fascinating. But unfortunately, I have to get to the next presentation. Fortunately,
Yes.
for more
Thank you
discussion on
so
new
much.
topics. But lovely to speak with you, Maria Noel.
Thank you.
So continue. We can have further Q&A as we go. Next, very happy and fortunate to have with us Tasmia Rahman from the World Bank. Over to you to share your work on gender and behavioral science.
All right. Let me quickly share my screen. Oops, sorry. Can you see the presentation?
Not yet.
Okay.
Don't stress, Tasmia. This is the demonstration effect.
Yes.
We are going to get there.
Okay. I think, are you able to see it now?
I think it's coming. Yes.
Great.
And if you go full screen now, please.
Yes.
Great.
Perfect.
All right. Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really great to see, so much interest in understanding and unpacking, gender issues. And particularly, I think one of the areas that's very close to my heart, because I've been working quite a bit on this, is trying to understand norms and really what they mean. How do we look at it? How do we understand it? So I know Maria Noel has sort of touched on this, and I think your last bit about how norms become internalized and they kind of become very separate, difficult even separate from what you think is normal versus what actually is, in fact, a dissonance in some ways, is kind of important. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the quantitative measurement of social norms, and really how to understand the level of impact that norms have on our behaviors and how to diagnose them. And this is largely based on a lot of the work that we've been doing both on gender and on other issues across various countries, including Latin America. Actually, we've done a study that focuses on violence against women and particularly intimate partner violence as well. But I'll try to kind of speak a little more on theory first and then give one of the examples from one of our work. So I guess to start with, I'm going to start with the definition of social norms. And I know that, many of you are probably familiar with this already, but it is really important that we have kind of a clear understanding of what it means, what social norms really mean when it comes to the measurement of social norms. So again, nothing new perhaps, but social norms are informal and often implicit rules of behavior and common knowledge that this rule is accepted within a social group. So what does this mean? It means that social norms are context dependent. They're often externally driven or externally derived. So this is, they're dependent on what other people are doing, what other people believe. And then they arise from social interdependence that allows us to sort of coordinate and maintain order within our societies. They're held in place collectively or by people who influence us and influence kind of our decision-making and behavior. This is what we refer to as the reference group, and we'll get more into that later in the presentation. And lastly, it has these perceived social rewards for compliance and then social sanctions for non-compliance. So these are sort of all things to keep in mind as we think about social norms and as we think about how to really understand and unpack social norms. So in a nutshell, social norms are, a social norm is a rule of obligatory, appropriate, typical, and acceptable behavior shared by people within the same group or society. And I think one thing we always say is in defining social norms, it's also important to understand what it's not, because we see that sometimes where people, when we're speaking about social norms, but in reality, it is actually something else. So social norms are not legal norms. Legal norms are essentially kind of the more formal written rules of society that are implemented by institutions that have, that can persecute you for non-compliance. It's also not moral norms, which are sort of more internally driven and value-based aspects that also affect our behavior. And lastly, these are different from customs, which are kind of the recurrent behaviors that arise from repetition, but isn't necessarily socially driven in the same way. Why measure social norms? We're talking a lot about gender here today. And I think one thing that we all can probably recognize is that both the theoretical and the empirical literature kind of consistently recognizes social norms as a driver for gender outcomes and all kinds of gender outcomes. So this is not necessarily in vacuum. So it's not like social norms sort of affect our behavior in and of itself. It's often in combination or through interactions with kind of households, markets, formal and informal institutions, and one of the informal institutions being social norms itself. Social norms can also act as a brake on social change. So it can actually inhibit, when we want to change our behavior, we do not, because we don't think that other people are doing that. At the same time, social norms can act as accelerators. So it can facilitate change in the behavior of those whose personal attitudes have not yet changed, but people around them have changed the behavior. But sort of despite this critical role that, that social norms play, social norms in general are kind of poorly understood. They're often, and for good reason, conflated with personal attitudes. And the good reason being that this data does not exist necessarily. It definitely does not exist at a large scale. It hasn't really been measured in the same rigorous way that a lot of other gender indicators have been, and which is sort of why we wanted to really go into trying to understand, well, what do we mean by gender norms and how exactly do we identify and measure this? So now the good news is there is a lot of work that has happened, and I think both practitioners as well as researchers have come up with or thought about many different ways in which social norms can be measured. Now we don't have a gold standard for this, as we might with some things, but from across these different research, we do agree on what are some of the kind of core elements of social norms measurement and sort of how to look at them. So these are the four things. One is behavior, which is what does a person do? And by respondent, when we're doing surveys, it's essentially what is the person in question doing? The next thing is attitudes. What does this person believe in? What is their personal attitude towards a certain behavior or a certain sort of rule of behavior? The next thing is the descriptive norm. It is also something that some people would call the social empirical expectation. So it is your observed behavior of others. What do we think other people do? And again, these are not necessarily what people actually do, but what we think other people do. And the last is injunctive norm or social normative expectations, which is what respondents believe that people should do, or what respondents believe that other people think that she should do. So I think the important thing to keep in mind is that, while these are, for example, descriptive norm and injunctive norm, while these are perceptions of what other people do, these are perceptions. These are subjective. It's what you think people are doing and what you think people would want you to do. They may not be accurate. And this is really where norms can become a powerful tool for both change or in terms of impeding the change that we want to see in communities. So there's a framework we have been following quite a bit in a lot of our work, which has been adapted largely from kind of Christina Bicchieri's norms measurement framework. And I wanted to walk you through it just to kind of give you an idea of how we go about understanding whether a particular behavior is driven by a social norm or by various other things that are also equally important. So let's think about a behavior in question. So we all want to look at gender outcomes. Let's think about women's labor force participation. So whether or not a woman should work or should join the labor force. So employment behavior can be based on unconditional preferences. So people would prefer to do something irrespective of what others are doing. So whether or not people around you are working or not, you would still sort of decide whether or not you want to work. Other people's decisions wouldn't factor in. This is what is generally, a collective custom, a shared moral rule or legal injunction. So essentially things I had mentioned earlier that are not social norms, that are a little different from social norms. Behavior might be driven by conditional preferences, which is people would choose to follow or do something because they believe that others are also doing the same. And there is a causality factor here, which is very hard to measure, but it is possible to measure as well. But it's essentially a behavior that is largely kind of driven or motivated by what is happening externally and around you. And this can be based on empirical expectations or descriptive norms, as we said. And when it's only that, it is a descriptive norm or even social proof, which is something we're more familiar with. when it is based on normative expectations as well, so not just what other people are doing, but what you think other people want you to do, then we have a social norm. And that's essentially sort of a potentially binding constraint that you might find. And in the situation where, we have social norms, what we're likely to see is sort of these high normative expectations, high empirical expectations that are more conservative. And then behavior is consistent with these empirical expectations, and the personal beliefs are then consistent with these normative expectations. So these are the situations where you're likely to see kind of norms play a role in the behavior itself. So I want to kind of walk you through an example of a measurement project that we did in Jordan. And this is looking specifically at what I was talking about earlier on whether or not it is okay for women to work. So in Jordan, we had done this study, and this is one thing I want to connect to Maria Noel's work is, it is extremely important, even in quantitative measurement, to really do some formative qualitative work, to understand the context, to really understand the various driving factors of behaviors and how many of these might be kind of normatively influenced or potentially, you look to others to sort of understand or influence your own behavior. So in Jordan, when we ask people, about their own personal attitudes about, do you think women should work? The encouraging thing is we see 96% of people say that yes, women should work. But as you can see, this sort of support for women's work actually starts declining as you start adding kind of more nuances to this. And the reason why we add these nuances is because we know that in reality, a woman's decision to work is not purely just based on her feelings or attitudes or, just in general about whether or not women should work, but a lot of other practical things that also come into play, which also has social implications. So whether a woman should work outside home, there are safety concerns associated. There are, masculinity aspects there. Whether she should work if she's married. There is the kind of traditional gender roles we see within the household. Whether children should be left with a relative. Whether they can work with men. And the place where we see things drop the most is when we ask, can a woman return work if she has to return home after 5 p.m., which is almost every, private sector job you might see in a lot of these countries. The support drops down from 96% to 26%. Now let's bring in social empirical expectations. Now, what do our respondents think other women do? And we see that this is actually not the same. It's kind of consistent. And in some ways it's based on the women you're probably seeing. So if you're seeing women working outside, you assume it is someone who probably has a child who's married, who has to kind of go through all of these things. So social empirical expectations tend to be somewhat consistent. What is interesting in the Jordanian context is empirical expectations are actually very positive. So in Jordan, the women's labor force participation rate is extremely low. It's actually one of the lowest in the region. And yet when we ask people how much they think women work, 63% thought that women in general work, that exist at a more kind of higher level of society. And it influences not one, but multiple behaviors. And this is very true for gender issues. And I think I've said, I'll share the link with this if anyone's interested. The Social Norms Atlas by the Allen Platform really nicely lays out what some of these meta norms are, where one single norm can actually impact multiple domains of behavior, particularly around the gender domains, domains of behavior on gender. The other thing to keep in mind is there's always a reference group. And this is the tricky part of measuring social norms, is there's usually not just one reference group, there are multiple reference groups, and it's important to identify who we're asking about. So when you're asking questions about, what other people think, these other people have to be people who are influential, who actually influence your decision-making, and particularly people who might be imposing some of the sanctions that are associated with a norm or the moving away from a norm. Social desirability bias is also something that we need to keep in mind when that can affect the accuracy of measurement, because these are obviously questions about perceptions, about attitudes, and there is a chance that people answer a certain way because they don't want you to, even the the researchers, to think that they're bad people, or the data collectors. So this is where incentives and other things, really thinking through the prompt that you have is important to make sure you're actually getting an accurate measurement of what is going on. The other thing is norm compliance can be enforced by the power holders. And the power holders can be within society, within your own household, because they are invested in maintaining the status quo for their own benefit in some ways. We've seen this across the board and across most gender issues, that men often tend to be these power holders in the household, and they end up having a lot of say in what women end up doing. So in some ways, they become almost a conduit for the social norms that exist at the community level for the woman. And naturally, it's also important to understand the sanctions. And there are many ways to measure it, but what the goal of this is to really understand that what is norm compliance being motivated by? Is it fears of the punishment? Are there rewards to non-compliers? And these can potentially become then a tool to inform policy and interventions. And lastly, on the intervention side, one thing we always look for when we look at norms is there pluralistic ignorance? So are people assuming that a norm exists when it in fact doesn't? And as we saw in Jordan, a lot of respondents agree, in fact, 96% agree that women should work, but their expectation of what other people feel is much lower. So this is a disconnect. And this is what we call a pluralistic ignorance, and something that allows a negative norm to perpetuate, but correcting that can potentially then encourage positive behavior. So, we always think of norms in terms of barriers and sort of what barriers they pose, but it's also exactly where the barriers are. It becomes a tool in itself sometimes for interventions to address the barriers, to address the misunderstandings and misperceptions that exist in society. And there, of course, in general, norms are very useful for solving social dilemmas that require coordination, because your behavior is actually coming from what others around you are doing. And that could be a positive, powerful influence as well. Are we good on time? I just want to quickly give a couple of examples. I know I'm talking a lot about measurement, but also just to say, there are many ways in which norm shifting interventions can go. And not all of these have to be, sort of correcting pluralistic ignorance. In our work at the World Bank, as well as in Embed, which is the team I work in, we've kind of done several things to tackle norms. So one interesting example is sort of an edutainment intervention that was done by our colleagues in Nigeria, as well as in other countries, which showed sort of by exposing people to sort of these differences and different attitudes, different behaviors via television, you actually can get people to start changing their behavior, because you start normalizing what Maria Noel was talking about as well. You start normalizing that behavior in their eyes. And in this case, this led to kind of huge increases in HIV testing and even lowered STD rates among women. Another way to do this is really circumvent the norms. So if there are norms around, for example, learning, if you think that children can only learn a certain way, that someone has sort of a natural endowment and that's the best they can do, so there's really no point in spending time or effort towards improving their educational outcomes. This is very true for girls, where it is perceived that girls perhaps are not as suitable for math or in general in the STEM field. These interventions can really start early. And in Peru, Indonesia, Macedonia, South Africa, several places, we did a social-emotional skills intervention that focused on sort of really building growth mindset and kind of changing the mindset up front on people's capacity to learn and their ability to learn. And this in the longer term actually ends up, in the short and the long term, ends up increasing test scores, as well as sort of the sense of belonging and your ability to accomplish something. And lastly, you could also prevent a norm from sort of really taking shape in some ways. So we've done quite a bit of work with Roma girls and education of Roma girls. And one thing we saw that, short videos with has information and aspirations from people that you can relate to, the people who would in your mind fall within your reference group. That exposure and the positive exposure really kind of sets the ground for a new norm to take shape. And this can be a powerful way to intervene as well. So I think that's all I had. I'm happy to take questions. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great, thanks so much for that, Tasmia. I think there's a lot there. Learn about the intricacies and nuances of applying norms, and not just social norms, but all the other ways we should consider thinking about it as well. Okay, so while questions come in, I just wanted to ask if Lone from, I think, DPPA, if you would like to ask your questions. It's about a specific domain of behavioral science application. You can ask yourself, or I can also read it out. So it's regarding, particularly when it comes to decision-making, including political decision-making. Have you done any thinking with respect to that and norms overall? And maybe Maria Noel, if she's here, she can come in as well.
So we haven't looked at political decision making in particular, and I think, and this is where sort of the different types of norms become important. That not everything is socially driven either. Political norms can become sort of very driven by the legal aspects of things, the legal norms that exist in society. So I think that would be one thing to think about: is this a socially driven behavior, and if so, then how do you go about measuring that? So there is obviously, I mean, we've seen in the US now as well that, you know, norms are definitely there. It normalizes a certain behavior. It normalizes a certain kind of even attitude and expressing that attitude. And there is actually quite a bit of literature, not us, but others have looked into how this norm change and norm shift actually happens. So it is a very interesting field. And we need to think about sort of the other enabling things that allow for a new norm to take shape within the political space, but we haven't looked at this in particular.
Zoe, would you like to come in? I know I asked the question before you were both on mute. Is that a clear enough answer? Do you have a specific element you'd like to ask about?
Thank you, Tasmia and Mary. I would love to hear what Marie-Noëlle would have to say about this as well, because it's, for me, this is, I think, where everything starts. If women are not in political decision-making structures, then how can they affect change with education and all kinds of other areas? So I would be very curious to hear if anyone has something to say on this. Thank you.
Great. I don't know if Marie-Noëlle, are you still here? Or she had to go to another meeting, so she may have left, but we can follow up with you.
So I just want to give an example. This is not from our work, but I know in India, there's been quite a bit of work that has come from kind of putting women as leaders, as local leaders, and what impact that has on gender outcomes throughout the community. And that does show really powerful impact of, you know, having women in decision-making roles can actually have impact beyond just sort of women's participation. It could overall lead to sort of better outcomes for women. So that increased exposure, that sort of shifting in gender norms, the visibility of it is really important. And I think this is one of the things about gender norms is what becomes visible is what people perceive. So even if it's in a smaller scale, if you make the behavior very visible, it could potentially start changing the way people see a certain thing.
Great, thanks for that, Tasmia. I think there are just so many areas of potential application exploration here. Okay, so we have a question from Ruben regarding M&E. Would you like to ask it yourself? I'll give you few moments to unmute if you would like.
Yeah, because as you sort of mentioned, like often, even when we put policy and legislation in place to adjust the norms, often we don't actually get the results we're looking for. So I was wondering what sort of M&E do you actually put into your measure, like into your, let's say, interventions, and how do you use that to increase like the ratchet system to change the norms you're trying to address?
Did you get that, Tasmia, or did you?
Could you repeat? Yeah, so that it was breaking off a little bit, sorry.
I can read the question, so I can maybe have it a bit more.
That would be great.
So I can also try to contextualize a bit. So do you have examples of M&E on the policy and legislation measures and how data can be used to ratchet up change in norms that you're trying to address? So what methods do you use to really affect change you hope to see?
Sure. I mean, so one thing is that, you know, norms have not really been measured, particularly kind of at that level, at a policy level. It's rare that norms are measured and norm measurements are actually taken into consideration. But in trying to really understand, so one of the this is not a gender literature, but for example, in the tax literature, there is a lot that you could do with just literally the administrative data that you have that look at, for example, how behavior changes over time and how the norms change over time. So by observing sort of how many people are paying and then kind of regurgitating that back to the population, you have an intervention right there that can kind of change the way people perceive how things are changing. M&E for me, I would say, is the reason why it's important to really start thinking more systematically about norms measurement is because if this is something we sort of bring into our measurement for any gender project early on, what it allows you to do is see, you know, to what extent are these norms shifting? Because you could change with an intervention people's attitudes. But if you're not shifting the attitudes of the larger community and norms are in fact a barrier, then you have a problem. So I would say, I mean, this is not typically done with M&E, But I think what you need to think about is in strong normatively influenced behaviors, you want to bring that in because it allows you to sort of understand why things are not moving and then what you can do to kind of change that.
Great, thanks for that. So there's just a quick question here regarding data access. So data on personal attitudes is available through a variety of like the World Values Survey and also on injunctive norms, but do you have any suggestions on where we can find data on social norms? Where would you recommend colleagues go for that?
So not a lot of large scale data exists. I know there are cases where it's very regional or very kind of specific to a country. I know Gauge has a lot of data on women and adolescent education as well as other gender outcomes. And this is now starting out to be a panel survey that they've done in Bangladesh and Nepal. But of course, again, like I said, this is very regionally focused. But that's a great example also of how to both qualitatively and quantitatively look at social norms and unpack it. Other than that, to be honest, so there is Emerge. I have the link to that I think we can share. Has kind of a repository of all the different data collection that has happened that is related to norms. And that's a useful tool to kind of look at to understand what measurement work has already been done in what contexts to some extent. But to be honest, this is a gap. And this is why we are very interested in working in this is because norms are not typically measured in the same way. I mean, I think the one place where you might see a little bit of normative measurement perhaps is, you know, in IPV, where people ask, you know, what do other women think, or what do other people think? How do they justify IPV and so on? So certain domains might have a little more data, but most do not. And I think this is where we need to start thinking about how to build this in and how to build this in a very concise way as well. Because the problem is when you get into norms, it could be potentially very wide. And as we saw, you know, there are proximal, meta, all of those norms. Which are the ones that are kind of critical to measure, and then how do we measure it is important. In terms of our team, and you know, we are happy to share data if that's interesting. We've done quite a bit of norms measurement around gender in Lebanon. We've done some studies on masculinity. This was an online survey that we did, kind of looking specifically at COVID and the impact it has on kind of intra-household norms or behaviors within the household. And that has been done across 3 countries as well. But in terms of a panel data that you sort of can look at, there's really very little. And I think Gauge would be one of the best examples of like a very well done social norm study.
Very interesting. Lots of work to be done. Okay, so we're running out of time. I'll try to get through a couple more if we can. So we have one here regarding how social norms by definition are a reference to a particular group. So studies must take this into account. What does this mean for research on gender norms, but that might not be transferable between contexts, countries, or cultures compared to other kinds of behavioral phenomena? So first, what does it mean for social norms? And then what does it mean compared to other behavioral science thinking in this space overall?
Yeah. So let's talk specifically about social norms. With social norms, reference network is extremely important because how you act or how you choose to behave, what you're observing around you, is what social norms are based on, right? But then it's not everyone. So it could be that across the country, and there are studies that actually show how national level norms and the norms at your own community or around you can be very different. And what is important is actually what's going on in your own community and what's going on in the people around you. So there is a lot, there's a lot of work, that goes into sort of the social network mapping and all of that. But I think Lori Heisen, Ben Kislagi, as well as several others have kind of very specific ways that you can measure some of these reference networks and reference groups. What's important is not just to identify people you observe around you, but people who can impose a sanction on your behavior. And it could be directly a sanction on your own behavior, or it could be a sanction that is imposed through, let's say, your husband. So for example, I mean, in Jordan, as well as in a lot of the contexts we've worked in, we found that men's role as the breadwinner, as the primary sort of income earner in the family. So that sort of masculinity norm is really important in deciding whether or not a woman works. And this is not direct, but it's very important. And this is where the norm sometimes isn't even, the imposition of this norm is not even just directly on you. It's actually coming through a husband. So really, it is important to go a little bit in depth. And I think this is where more work can actually be useful, is to understand who are the reference networks, who are the people within the reference network who are preventing you from acting a certain way. But at the same time, who are the positive influencers who can then empower you to break a barrier, to really become a nonconformist and actually do something different. So it's very critical that you understand the reference network. In general, we know that all behaviors can be socially driven. So the reference group is important in the behavioral literature, which is also why, even when it comes to diffusion of information, something as basic as that, it doesn't have to be norms, it could be diffusion of information. We really go about trying to understand the reference network, the people, the nodes within that network, who can diffuse the information the fastest, as well as who can diffuse the information in the most, sometimes in the most credible way. So in the behavioral science work, it is actually very important to not only understand the reference group, but sort of the different nodes within the reference network to help you think through where the positive and negative influences are coming from, and then how you can potentially use those to actually achieve an outcome that you're trying to get.
Great, thank you. It's helpful as we consider all the different areas of application for behavioral science. So if we can keep you for a few more moments, Tasmia, maybe we'll get to one last question. So we have one here from Natalie. I don't know if you'd like to ask it yourself. I can also, oh, you said you can't, I'll ask it for you. So this is about gender-based violence, but have you done work or consideration or read anything with respect to turning bystanders into upstanders? So can imagine this is one way of getting into the larger goal, sort of fight gender-based violence, fight discrimination, but wondering if you've taken this sort of angle into account in your project. So any thoughts you have on that would be appreciated.
Sure. So we haven't worked on specifically that. We've done kind of some work on measuring the norms around gender-based violence, sort of perceptions, etc. I think similar to what Maria and Noel also talked about. But I think one thing that Maria and Noel also mentioned, and it is important to point out, is oftentimes we make the mistake of, and a lot of information campaigns in the past have focused on the negative, what is going on that is wrong. And what that might inadvertently end up doing is normalizing a behavior that's actually not something we want, right? So if you think 90% of people do this, then you start thinking, oh, well, I mean, whether I agree with it or not, I wouldn't act out on it because it seems like this is a very common behavior. Part of the bystander, I mean, we haven't done work in this, but in general, I mean, part of this is also to think about how do you empower people around you with that information, where everyone feels that, okay, well, I mean, the society I live in is different from what I thought. And therefore, then you start imposing a sanction, because social norms largely, depend on these sanctions and rewards. And where does that come from? The people around you, the bystanders potentially. And so I think this is where working with them is very important, and empowering them with the right numbers, with the sort of more positive norms, is also going to be very important. So social norms interventions can happen, some of it can be sort of at the individual household level, particularly around husbands and sort of the spousal gender roles, etc. But another thing happens kind of at the larger community level, where the bystander sanction can be reduced, or the reward from the bystanders can be increased. And I that's very important in general.
Very interesting, very interesting. I think this is a topic that many are exploring. So with that, I think we've reached the end of our time here today. I've gone over a little bit already. Thank you so much to the presenters, Maria Noel and Tasmia. Really great to hear your work in this space. I think you've mentioned a few resources, so maybe we can share those afterward. Tasmia, some of the surveys, some of the data that you referenced. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact Johanna or myself. And looking forward to seeing you at our next webinar. So thanks so much. Bye, everyone.